The liquid leaked slowly, thick, dark, fetid. It dripped from the edges of the royal coffin and formed a puddle on the chapel floor. No one had the courage to clean it up. But the dogs came. They wandered through the night, guided by the smell of death, until they found what no servant dared to touch, the remains of the king. Henry VIII, the monarch who ordered wives beheaded, was now being licked by hungry animals, the rotting flesh, still warm, flowing between the sacred stones. And no matter how much they tried to wash it, the smell never left. My name is Philip, and if you, like me, believe there are stories that were hidden from books because they were too cruel, then you're in the right place. Check if you're already subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I'm always curious. This channel was made to reveal what royal halls, courts, and churches tried to erase. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's history. And history, when told unfiltered, hurts. But before this flesh became a scandal, it was once revered. Before being remembered as a decomposing monster, Henry VIII was celebrated as the most handsome prince in Europe. Tall, athletic, red-haired, with the bearing of a warrior and the speech of a statesman, he was the perfect portrait of what was expected from a king. Ambassadors wrote letters praising his almost divine appearance. The court smiled at him with admiration, not fear, and at that time no one could imagine that this same body would become a fetid, living prison. They said he looked as if sculpted in marble. At 17, when he assumed the throne, Henry VIII was seen as the pinnacle of Renaissance virility. Records from the time speak of a young man nearly 2 meters tall, with broad shoulders, a slim waist, and penetrating eyes. He dressed with elegance, rode like a warrior, and danced like a Venetian nobleman. There wasn't a princess who didn't wish to be his queen, nor a courtier who dared question his brilliance. All of England saw him as a divine sign. But this physical perfection also fed something deeper, vanity. A vanity that, over time, would cease to be a trait and become a curse. Because for a man who thought himself untouchable, any flaw would become unbearable. And it was precisely because he wanted a perfect heir, a male child who would perpetuate his glory, that Henry began to change the course of history. He couldn't accept the idea of growing old beside a wife who wouldn't give him sons. He couldn't accept being limited by a pope. And that's when he broke with Rome, not for faith, but for desire. A desire that years later would leave him surrounded by ghosts, blood, and silence. But the body that was once a symbol of power also carried the seed of ruin. It was January 1536. The cold cut through the air in Greenwich, but inside the royal arena the climate was different. Euphoria, betting, spectacle. Henry VIII, already 44 years old, wore his most gleaming armor. He still saw himself as the invincible youth, and on that day he mounted his horse as if time hadn't passed. The crowd shouted, he waved, the king seemed eternal. But eternity lasted only seconds. At the thrust of the lance, the horse stumbled. Its front hooves failed. And then came the dry sound, a dull thud that silenced the field. The king flew, and in the next instant, the horse in desperation collapsed on top of him. A ton of living weight, crushing a man who carried an empire on his shoulders. Henry didn't move, not a groan, not a blink. Minutes passed and the court began to stir. Servants ran. Guards turned pale. No one dared speak of death, but the smell of fear was already spreading. 2 hours passed before he opened his eyes. He was breathing, but that body was no longer the same. A deep injury had struck his right leg, a wound that refused to close. In the days that followed, doctors applied ointments, bandages, and empty promises, but nothing worked. The flesh began to swell, darken, open up. Thus was born a wound that would never heal. The smell was the first to arrive. Even before entering the halls, the servants knew where the king was. Just follow the odor. The ulcer constantly suppurated pus and blood, and as time passed, it seemed more alive. But it wasn't just the leg that was rotting. Henry, who once laughed at banquets, now gritted his teeth at any contradiction. His eyes lost their shine, they gained suspicion, anger came without warning, and when it came, it took heads. Modern historians suggest that the accident may have caused brain trauma, and that this accentuated a personality already marked by pride and thirst for control. The fact is, after the fall, the king was never the same again. The flesh opened, the smell came, and with it the monster was born. But the wound that wouldn't close was just the beginning, because soon the entire body began to rebel against the king himself. With the advancement of the infection came restrictions. First, he stopped practicing sports. Then, he stopped walking long distances. In a short time, he could barely get out of bed without help. And then, he began to gain weight. But it wasn't just weight. It was a grotesque transformation, slow, silent, humiliating. His waist, which was once 89 centimeters, grew to exceed 130. His weight surpassed 180 kilos. Clothes had to be remade, furniture reinforced, and when even that wasn't enough, they created a system of ropes and pulleys to move the king between rooms, as if he were an object, enormous, fragile, rotten inside. The palace halls were modified, doors widened, thrones adapted, beds reinforced. There was no more nobility in that body, just a burden that the entire court was forced to endure in silence. And still, no one could mention pain. No one could suggest limitation, because the king continued to demand reverence, even when the smell of gangrene made servants cover their faces with perfume-soaked cloths. But the truth is that the odor wasn't the worst. The worst was the gaze. Henry began to distrust everything. He feared betrayal, poisoning, sidelong glances. He had every dish, every cup, every utensil tested. Mirrors were covered, corridors emptied. The king lived surrounded by a tense silence, heavy, about to explode. And it did explode, frequently. Outbursts of fury became routine. A late servant, a misinterpreted comment, a noble who breathed at the wrong moment. A detail was all it took, and the head would roll. The wound was no longer just in his leg, it was in his soul. The entire court walked on eggshells. The palace, once full of music, was now a temple of contained sighs. And each day, another piece of that man, who was once called the embodiment of the Renaissance ideal, disappeared under layers of pain, resentment, and rotting flesh. But if the body no longer obeyed, the ego still screamed. Henry couldn't bear the idea of being seen as weak. He needed to prove to the court, to God, and to himself that he was still king, that he was still a man. And so it was that, at the height of his illness, he decided to marry again, not for love, not for political alliance, but for vanity. And it was at this moment that she appeared, a young woman with large eyes, a practiced smile, and age enough to be his granddaughter. She was 19, he was 49, and had a body that could no longer support even his own crown. Catherine Howard wasn't chosen for politics, nor for love. She was chosen for vanity. The king needed something to make him forget the smell of his own rotting flesh, something that would make him believe, if only for moments, that he was still desired. And Catherine was that. Young, light, trained to smile with fear and obey without understanding. When she entered the palace, the court disguised their discomfort with applause, but everyone saw it. The contrast was grotesque. Henry could barely walk anymore. He needed to be hoisted by pulleys. The wound in his leg constantly leaked, infecting sheets, clothes, and the very air. Servants learned to breathe through their mouths when he approached, but Catherine had no choice. They say that on their wedding night, she cried silently, that she turned her face when he tried to touch her, that she trembled feeling the heat of his body approaching, heavy, sweaty, stinking of old blood and pus. She wasn't a wife, she was a symbol, a living doll placed there to feed the illusion of a king who no longer had a mirror, only shadows. And like so many women crushed by palaces and silences, Catherine sought refuge. a human touch, a body that didn't hurt, a face that didn't terrify. She found this in the arms of a courtier, young, alive, fragrant. It was enough. When the news reached the king, the world stopped. Henry didn't shout, didn't move, just ordered an investigation, then arrest, then death. Catherine was dragged to the Tower of London. She begged for mercy, asked for forgiveness, trembled, cried, but it was too late. On the morning of her execution, she begged to practice laying her head on the block. She wanted to get it right. She wanted it over quickly. They say that in the seconds before the blade fell, her eyes didn't search for the sky. They searched for a face, any face, that still saw her as human. The cut was clean. And on the other side of the city, the king closed the curtains. He stayed alone. He didn't speak to anyone for days, not to God, not to his ghosts. Perhaps there, in the silence of the room, heavy with rot and defeat, he understood. She lost her head, but he had already lost his soul. But if Catherine's head rolled in silence, the screams that would come after echoed throughout the court, because what began as a wound in the leg turned into a collapse of the body, and what seemed merely paranoia became institutionalized terror. Henry no longer trusted anyone. Title, blood, history didn't matter. Suspicion, however small, was enough. And so the royal halls began to empty. Servants disappeared from one hour to the next. Councillors were called to meetings and never returned. The king ordered the execution of childhood friends, loyal allies, even members of his own family, all because of rumors or silences. The decay of power, and the worst part was that no one dared to challenge him, because it only took one sideways glance, one misplaced word, one yawn at the wrong time, and the verdict was sealed. Treason. The king no longer needed evidence, only fear. The man who was once a symbol of diplomacy now handed out death sentences with the same ease with which he once offered invitations to banquets. Nothing needed to be said. The silence was more fatal than any accusation. It was enough for the king to be suspicious, enough for a whisper to reach his ears, a rumor, a dream. And then came the interrogations, the imprisonments, and the damp steps of the Tower of London. Between 1540 and 1547, Henry ordered the killing of councillors, doctors, monks, and nobles, even cousins, people who grew up with him, who shared victories, confessions, and prayers with him, all thrown away by a king who no longer saw faces, only threats. The court lived in constant vigilance. Guards doubled their shifts. Servants whispered in corners, afraid even to cough, eyes lowered when he passed. No one knew any more what was permissible to say, or even to feel. And while fear grew, the king's body decayed ever more rapidly. The wounds on his legs worsened. Doctors applied mercury treatments, arsenic mixtures, and hot iron to cauterize. His screams echoed through corridors that once heard music. The flesh no longer responded. The pain was constant. Gangrene set in. The necrotic skin changed color. Red, purple, black. Pus seeped beneath the bandages. The smell could be detected 3 rooms away, and still, no one dared suggest that the king was dying, because according to the law, predicting the monarch's death was treason. The charade was maintained until the end. Doctors lied. The court smiled in public appearances, and the king, propped up on blood-stained pillows, demanded reports, reverences, and silence. But in the early hours, in the interval between fevers and delirium, he murmured names: Jane Seymour, Anne Boleyn. Sometimes he called for children who weren't even there anymore. Other times, he said nothing. He just wept. The throne remained intact, but the man no longer existed, and everyone knew the fall wouldn't come with a sword, but with the final breath of a body that, for a long time, had carried only weight and remorse. But not even silence could hide the inevitable. No matter how much doctors lied, servants disguised, and the court pretended normality, the end was already in the room, and inside the body. His breathing weakened, fevers returned with greater force, and the smell could no longer be ignored, even with rare perfumes from France. Death, which Henry so feared, didn't come all at once. It dragged itself in, it settled, and began to announce its presence long before the final breath. The winter of 1547 seemed heavier than previous ones. Servants walked with heads bowed. The royal chamber was isolated. Few had permission to enter. Even those closest avoided contact, not out of respect, but out of fear. The king's body was no longer a body. It was a field of advanced decomposition. His legs were consumed by gangrene. The flesh, dark and necrotic, seemed about to disintegrate at any touch. Open wounds exposed bone. There were days when he screamed without stopping. Others when he merely stared at the ceiling with still eyes, as if he were no longer there. On the night of January 27th, Henry allowed them to call Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. He could no longer speak, but when asked if he died in the Christian faith, he squeezed the archbishop's hand firmly. It was his last conscious gesture. Hours later, England's most feared king stopped breathing. But death did not end the decay. It merely made it public. His body, enormous and unstable, required a custom-made coffin. The embalming process was rushed, poorly done, ineffective, and while the body awaited funeral at Cannes Abbey Chapel, the inevitable happened. The coffin swelled. Internal gases began to pressure the joints of the wood, and then, during the early hours, a dark trickle began to run down the sides. The liquid traversed the stone floor until reaching the edges of the altar. There, stray dogs that had invaded the chapel licked the putrid fluid in front of two shocked servants. No one dared tell. No one dared clean it up. They merely recorded what they saw and buried the king as he was. Henry VIII, who defied the Pope, founded a church, and executed wives as one changes clothes, was delivered to the earth, leaking from all sides. The end wasn't majestic. It was dirty, silent, and perhaps deserved. But even buried, the weight of his presence still hovered over the throne. The funeral took place almost 3 weeks after his death, on February 16th, 1547. It was a grand ceremony, as required by the etiquette for a monarch. Trumpets, processions, black garments, all carefully rehearsed to hide what everyone already knew. The king who lay there was no longer feared. He was remembered with relief. He was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him the son he so desired. But the heir, Edward VI, still a child, inherited more than the crown. He inherited a divided kingdom, a court full of scars, and a name that weighed more than he could carry. Edward would reign for only 6 years. He died at 15, consumed by diseases that his own father may have provoked by leaving him surrounded by tensions, intrigues, and impossible promises. With the boy king's death, succession passed to Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the wife whom Henry abandoned for not giving him a male heir. Mary tried to restore Catholicism, to reverse everything her father had changed. But time doesn't turn back, and it was only then, with the ascension of Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman whom Henry falsely accused and had beheaded, that England knew stability. The daughter of the heretic, the daughter of the woman he tried to erase from history, was the one who transformed the country into an empire. Henry VIII built his image with sword and fear, but in the end he was defeated by what he most despised, the women he discarded. History didn't absolve him, nor did it forget, because no matter the size of the throne, the wealth of the crown, or the force of the decree, the body rots, power passes, and the name becomes memory. In Henry's case, a memory that still stinks, still disturbs, still confronts. But the body that leaked from the corners of the chapel wasn't buried alone. With it descended also the promise of an eternal empire, of an invincible dynasty, and what remained was an uncomfortable silence, because Henry VIII's death didn't erase his mistakes. It merely handed them to his children, along with the crown. And that's where history showed its cruelest irony. Edward VI, the long-awaited heir, was as fragile as a breath. He had debilitated health from birth. He assumed the throne at just 9 years old, still not understanding that he had been conceived at the cost of blood, separations, and fallen heads. For 6 years the boy king tried to reign, tried to continue his father's project, but his body never supported the weight that history imposed on him. At 15, he fell ill, wasted away, and died, without leaving heirs, without time to correct anything, without even aging. And with that, the throne passed to whom Henry never wanted to see crowned. Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the woman he publicly humiliated, removed from the palace, and accused of being useless for not bearing a male heir. Mary took power with a clear desire to erase the traces of the Protestant Reformation and restore the Catholic faith. She ruled with strength, but also with blood. Hundreds of Protestants were executed under her reign, and England, already traumatized, began to call her Bloody Mary. Henry wanted an heir to ensure stability, but what he left was instability, vengeance, and blood between siblings. And then she came. Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman he falsely accused of treason, the woman he had beheaded. Elizabeth, daughter of the cursed Queen, was who truly brought England to its peak. She governed with intelligence, strategy, and a firm hand. She reigned for 44 years, stabilized the kingdom, expanded maritime power, transformed the country into an empire. She didn't just inherit the crown, she redeemed history, and with that, the king who spent his life trying to erase women from power ended up immortalized precisely because of them. But even with the throne in hand, not even Elizabeth could erase the smell of what was left behind. Because what Henry left wasn't just a lineage, it was a divided country, a torn faith, and a trail of pain that infiltrated the walls of castles and the sermons of churches. And no matter how much the crown shone under the light of his daughter's reign, the weight of the rot he spread was still there. That was the king's true legacy. Post-Henry England was a nation in a state of cauterization. The temples were cracked from within, families divided, archives full of crossed-out names. No one knew anymore what was sacred or forbidden. He had broken with Rome to satisfy his will, founded a new church, not out of faith, but out of convenience. He taught the people that religion could be molded like hot iron, and that the altar, if necessary, was also a place of execution. This was the invisible legacy, a culture of fear disguised as renewal. In the following years, each king and queen who ascended to the throne had to deal with the rubble he left behind. The religious reforms, the broken oaths, the political pacts sown with blood. Henry left a model of absolute power that dispensed with limits, a power that answered to neither church, nor people, nor God. And the most tragic thing is that many, in the centuries that followed, would try to imitate him. His mark remained not only in books, but in institutions, in the way the monarchy came to behave. In the way the throne came to demand reverence, not because it deserved it, but because it threatened. The body was gone, the stench passed, but the model of government still inspired fear. The inheritance of a rotten body is not just the memory of decomposition, it is the echo of decisions made with vanity, blood, and pride. And England's history since then would carry that smell, even when no one dared speak of it anymore. But what perhaps most frightens about the history of Henry VIII is not the blood nor the stench. It's the fact that even after everything, so many still called him Majesty, that even while he rotted alive, servants knelt, counsellors lied, and the people obeyed, as if the crown were capable of covering even decomposing flesh. Henry VIII died a king, but he didn't die with dignity. His body leaked. His soul was lost amidst so many executions, betrayals, and pacts made with his own ego. He didn't conquer death, nor time, nor history itself. Because the true end didn't happen when his heart stopped, but when his name became synonymous with tyranny, Today, his image still adorns books and films, but what isn't shown is what remained behind the scenes. The unbearable smell, the clothes soaked in pus, the court in absolute silence before a man who no longer inspired respect, only fear. The throne became a prison, the crown a disguise, and the reign a warning that power without limits rots, that vanity without conscience devours, and that no body, no matter how royal, resists internal decay. Henry's name continues in history, but not as he dreamed, not as a hero, nor as a martyr. He was marked as the king who ended up defeated by himself, and perhaps that's the greatest lesson that history refuses to teach in schools, that even the most absolute power stinks when it dies, and that every empire built on blood and silence one day runs down to the floor. Stories like Henry VIII's don't end with a period. They continue in the legacies they left, in the lies they told, and in the bodies that no one dared to properly bury. So subscribe to the channel now, because the video appearing on your screen brings another real story that school books preferred to erase, and perhaps it's even more disturbing. See you there.